I'm Chris Davidson. I oversee global strategy for MMGY Global, and I'm really excited this morning to be introducing our featured speaker, Steve Cohen, the head of our Travel Insights group. So we're introducing, as we do every year, our Portrait of American Travelers research study. And you know, at MMGY, everything we do is based upon the research that we do. So every year we invest literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think many of you know this, but we invest hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in understanding how travelers behave, how they think, how they plan, research, and book, and also ultimately experience travel. So because of that, we believe that the research that we do reveals the insights that ultimately then drive strategy. So that's kind of our basic model as a company. Getting a little bit of feedback here still. Okay, sorry. Should I keep moving or not move? Okay. So anyway, it's if you look back, I think we're talking about the portrait today, but just so all of you are aware, of those of you who may be a little bit less familiar with MMGY and what we do, we also have a lot of other research. So our DK Shiflett division profiles where people travel, what they spend, who those people are, where they go, all sorts of details about performance in terms of where people have traveled. And that we interview about 100,000 people every year to get that data. So it's one of the most comprehensive studies in the U.S. for the U.S. domestic traveler. We also do our Travel Horizon study, which looks out over the next 6 months and says, what do we expect to happen in travel over the next 6 months? It's the only forward-looking piece of work in travel. It's a recurring study. We've been doing that now every quarter since 2007. So it's a pretty interesting trend line of what's happening in the world of travel and what will happen. And then we also have our custom research where we do everything from inform and inspire the development of brands to inform campaign strategies and then ultimately measure the results of those campaigns and markets. So again, it's really the foundation of everything we do as a company. So it's very important to us. It's not just a study we do. It really is the foundational work for the agency. In the past, we've talked about a number of things. You may, if you've been to these in the past or read the portrait study in the past, you may remember things like celebration vacations, where we talked about the importance of traveling places specifically to celebrate an important life event. And the Walt Disney Company then took that information a couple of years ago and that insight and built a 2-year promotional campaign called What Will You Celebrate around that. And it was ultimately one of what they described as the most successful promotional campaign they'd ever done. We've exposed or revealed the kind of resurgence of travel agents in the business. And importantly, how they were, it's been important amongst the younger traveler, which was pretty surprising, I think, to all of us. And we've looked at, a lot of other things in the past, and most recently last year we talked about, kind of a cautionary tale about thinking about all millennials as the same, type of traveler that think and behave in similar fashion, when we know that they're quite different. Obviously, there's a lot of different life stages represented within the millennial generational cohort. So it's important to keep those things in mind. And this year, Steve's going to reveal some pretty interesting things, I think, as part of our overview of what we found this year. And so he's going to talk about a group of travelers that we call the culinary explorers, and how those are a little bit different than the typical kind of culinary traveler, somebody who just travels and food is important to them. But what is it about the culinary explorer that's a little bit different? We're going to talk about the changing motivations in travel. So Steve will kind of describe this deepening, more complex set of decisions or motivations that really impact where and why people travel and why they behave the way they do when they do travel. And then we'll have kind of fun at the end where we know that there are differences between how self-described liberals might view the world and compared to self-described conservatives, but how do those people think about travel? So we did we went into the data and we can pull that out, and we looked at some of the differences in terms of how those self-described kind of personas think a little bit differently about the world of travel and how they behave when they travel. So lots of good stuff, and I think you'll be intrigued. And I do want to emphasize that this is kind of a top-level tease in terms of what we have in the data. And over the next 4 quarters, we'll be revealing additional insights. We release 1 paper a quarter over the next 4 quarters, given that this is the 2018-2019 portrait. And those will start coming out in Q3. So look for those. We'll obviously be very happy to share that information with all of you. And again, thank you so much for coming. We're excited to have you here. And Without further ado, I want to introduce our featured speaker. Steve Cohen is our Senior Vice President of Travel Insights, and he's going to walk us through some of the highlights from this year's Portrait of American Traveler. So Steve, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back again. For those of you who were here last year, I remember it was really hot out. That's because I'm from Orlando and I bring it with me. So the last 2 days you can blame on me. We're going home in the next day, so we're hopeful it'll be a little bit nicer for you. Thanks for coming. It's great to see so many familiar faces. As Chris said, I'm going to take you through the portrait and the things that we learned this year. I should point out that we collect about 4,000 different pieces of data. Some of them are really exciting, some of them not so much, but we spend a pretty substantial amount of time combing through all of it to come up with what do we think the story is for travel this year. There are countless stories. We're going to take you through a couple of them today. That doesn't mean that's all of them. So over the course of the year, as Chris mentioned, we'll be releasing some other things that we think are noteworthy, interesting, that we might not have talked about in the past. But with that said, if you have questions throughout the year about, do we know something about a particular topic that we may not have covered today? Well, we probably do if it pertains to travel. We ask people about all different travel behaviors, and happy to share those with you. So today, I'm going to take you through the portrait. This is the 28th year that we've done the portrait. It's the 4th time we've done this event, and happy to be able to share it with such a broad audience. So the first bit of news is the slowdown continues. For those of you who were with us in 2016 when we presented this, we forecast a record travel year. Travel intentions up at levels we'd never seen before. And as the year played out, that's what happened. We saw travel like we'd never seen it before. Last year, we forecast continuing growth, but not at the same level that we'd seen in the previous year. This year, we're starting to see a bit of a slowdown, and I'll take you through what that means and how we interpret that and where we think the market's going to go. Here, you can see this is a net variance in future vacation intention, so it sounds like I'm a statistics professor. I'm not that at all. It's a kind of a misleading chart. What we're showing is people who say, we ask people, are you going to travel more, same, or less in the next 12 months? We throw out the people who say the same. And we take the more, subtract the less, and we come up with a net intention. Every year since 2007, we've seen a positive intention in future vacation intentions. This year's the first time we see a decline, meaning more people are saying they're going to take fewer vacations. That doesn't mean that there will be fewer vacations taken. It means that people are saying, I'm going to take fewer on a net basis. We don't know how many fewer. So you could have people who are saying, I'm going to take 10 more, but then people are saying, well, I'm going to take 20 fewer. I mean, I'm giving you vast examples, but it doesn't mean that vacations are going to decline. It means that we're seeing more people saying they're going to take less. We don't quantify the number less. So we look at number of trips. Last year, people took 3 trips. The previous year, they took 3.3. So it doesn't seem like a big deal when you go from 3.3 down to 3. It's a 9-point difference, a 9 percentage difference. And in the next 12 months, 2.9. So the statistician in me says this isn't a particularly significant number when you see a difference from 3 to 2.9. And we wouldn't necessarily highlight this. We just want to point out that we're seeing perhaps something starting to go in a negative way. So we're dropped 1/10 of a percent, or 1/10 of a trip. So it may turn into something greater. Right now, we can't forecast that because it's within our margin of error. Now we'll look at spend. So if you go back, we talked about 2016 record travel year. This is how much households spent on vacations. And you can see the numbers range from about 4,000 up to 4,600. Now we see a decline in the amount of spend. And I wouldn't say it's a decline to the extent where we should raise the red flags and start being panicked about what's going on, because we're going to look at it as it relates to vacationing, a number of vacations versus spend. So what we see here is travelers spent 5% less. So what they told us at the beginning of the year is, here's how much I think I'm going to spend. And at the end of the year, we asked again, how much did you spend last year? And we saw about a 5% difference. If I were to ask you right now, how much do you think you'll spend on vacations in the next 12 months? You'd come up with some number. The extent to which that number is accurate, well, you could be the judge of that. I can't tell you how much I'm going to spend. I'm actually kind of impressed that it was only 5% off. I mean, honestly, if you think about the last year, if I said to you, how much did you spend on travel in the last 12 months? Could you tell me how much you spent? I think Richard could. Richard always knows he's got the calculator out. He knows how much he'd spent. So the fact of the matter is, whenever we ask a question of how much are you going to spend, how much did you spend, there's going to be some kind of error in it. We're actually kind of surprised that it's such a narrow error. This year, people are telling us that there's no difference. They're going to spend about the same amount on travel as they did in 2017. So take that as it will. We think there's a narrow error around that. In addition with spending, people are spending more per vacation. So this is where I mentioned earlier, if you look at the fact that number of vacations down slightly, amount of spending is down. However, if you look at amount of spend per trip, the differences in both are such that we end up with actually a positive, an increase in the amount of spend per trip. If you have people who are spending less money but are taking fewer trips, if that makes sense, you end up in doing the math, and it ends up with we're actually spending more per trip. So Chris mentioned earlier Travel Horizons. I'm going to just talk about Travel Horizons for a minute before we get back into the portrait. Travel Horizons was created in 2007 in the first quarter when we saw the economy was about to head in a bad way. And we said, let's put a stake in the ground and say, how are we looking now? And then over the course of the impending recession, where does travel go? When does travel come out of the recession? And what does it look like now? So everything we show is pegged to first quarter 2007, which you'll agree is a little bit right before the economy started heading south. We created something called the Traveler Sentiment Index. And you can see it's something like the Consumer Confidence Index focused only on travel. So we take these 6 elements of travel, we put them together, we take that result and compare it to what we got in first quarter of 2007. What we end up is a graph that looks a lot like the Consumer Confidence Index chart. And some of you have seen this before. What I'd like to point out is a couple things. One, if you were to take consumer confidence and plot it on this same chart, it would look surprisingly similar. The numbers would be lower because consumer confidence was hit much harder than travel. You all were in the business back during the recession. People have the sense that I'm still going to travel. I'm going to figure out a way to travel. Travel matters to people. For those of you who were in the business back on September 11th, we assumed that people would just stop traveling completely. What we saw was a difference in the way that people traveled. People started traveling more with families, and family travel became much more important back in 2001. Travel didn't go away. It softened, certainly. And so what we're seeing here is that travel softened, but it didn't soften as much as confidence in the economy. So as you look at the end of the graph, you see a little bit of softening from the last quarter to this quarter. So we're at an index of 115, which was 15 points above where we were when we started the project. You can see that in the third quarter of 2013 is when we say travel came out of the recession. So the travel recession ended about 5 years ago, and everything since then has been above that 100. One thing I want to point out is we look at travel, it's very cyclical, as you know. We're in the peak travel season. Interestingly, in the last week, from social media, I've learned that 6 of my friends, none of whom know each other, are all in Alaska at the same time. I don't know how this happened, of all places. Summer travel season is upon us, and so Chris mentioned we do this survey every quarter. The second quarter, when we did these questions in April, people are looking primarily at their summer travel. So while we're forecasting a year of soft travel, second quarter travel remains incredibly strong. And I'll show you there's a significant increase in people saying they're likely to travel this quarter versus other quarters in previous years. So you're saying, well, on the one hand, you're saying travel's softening. And on the other hand, it's up. It's up in the second quarter. The rest of the year, we don't expect it to show that increase. In fact, we showed you first quarter numbers, they're down. We expect fourth quarter numbers to also be down because as people are looking out 6 months, while you could say, well, in January, they could have been looking at the beginning of their summer vacations, they weren't. What happens is when we do it in April, we always see the highest number, and that holds true here. So now I'll go back to portrait. A number of you may have seen recent articles that we've been quoted in about road trips. We've had a lot of coverage of road trips because they're back in a place where they haven't been in a long time. And we're seeing them taken by people who may or may not have grown up with road trips. So we saw that 51% of all of our travelers took a road trip in the past 12 months, up 5 points. I should point out, we asked people likely to take a road trip in the next 12 months, that number is 60. So 60% of the people say that they're likely to take a road trip this year. So we see a continuing increase in road trips. And we ask people why they're going to do that. And they talk about things like no set itinerary, can make as many stops as I want, no airline hassles. But I want to point out, because I've been asked, well, where are people going on their road trips? There are a couple of different ways to look at that. One, people go on road trips it depends on where they start. So I live in Florida. Where I'm going to go on a road trip is going to be very different than where you go on a road trip. But what we also see is people taking road trips where they're flying to a destination and then taking a road trip. So they're flying to Arizona and then going to see the national parks in Utah and the Grand Canyon. They're flying to Denver and they're driving to Yellowstone and they're seeing all the wonders of the West. So when we traditionally look at road trips, we thought of people packing up the car and heading out on the road. It's not necessarily that. We're seeing people who are flying to take their road trip vacation. Because in some cases, where they can go from where they live, they've seen it already. They want to start somewhere else and see something different, but still not be constrained by itineraries and be able to do what they want on the road and stop wherever they want. Now I'll show you something that, every year we talk about this, the destinations that people would most like to visit. Now what we're showing this year is not the same that we've shown every year. Every year we see that the Hawaii and Honolulu and the Hawaiian neighbor islands are the top destination. People want to go there, they aspire to visit this destination. So what we thought we'd do this year is share with you what are the destinations that have had the greatest increase in interest in visiting over the past 5 years. So it was some number, and now it's at some number higher. Anyone like to guess what the biggest increase for any US destination is? There's a valuable prize. Well, there isn't anything except admiration of your fellow attendees. Anyone have a guess? Charleston. Nashville. Sorry? Texas. That's kind of broad. Can you be a little more specific? Austin, okay? Well, let's see. These four are up 8 points in the last 5 years. So someone said Texas, which is kind of not the best guess because you get to take every part of Texas. These are up 8 points. We have 4 more that are up 9 points. Washington, D.C. is number 2 right now. And Niagara Falls, increase in visiting the falls. But no one has guessed the number 1 destination in terms of increase. Sorry? Denver. Close. Not really. The number 1 increase is New Orleans. People want to go to New Orleans, so think about with Katrina, interest in visiting New Orleans dropped. People didn't want to go there. It had suffered a natural disaster. They didn't want to visit. Now, over time, the interest in visiting has returned, and so have the visitors to New Orleans. So New Orleans getting visitors like they haven't gotten in a long time, and people expressing an interest in visiting. So you have to think about when it's increase in interest, well, was it low before and high now, and what would cause that to happen? And yeah, I agree, Nashville, one of the places that we see. However, Nashville's demand was never particularly low. So on this chart, if we were to take it down a little further, Nashville's at plus 6 points. Now we'll take a look at the forecast in terms of types of vacations. We haven't shown this before. We asked people on a percentage basis, how many vacations do you take that are weekend? How many do you take that are weekday or extended, meaning 5 days plus? And I want to share with you the difference between the red line and the black line. There are more 5-day plus vacations being taken as a percentage of total vacations. And it's coming almost exclusively at the expense of the weekend vacation. So how does that tie in? We talked about people taking fewer vacations but spending more money per vacation. Well, now you can see why. They're taking a longer vacation. So they're spending more on the longer vacation. And you can see we're up 4 points in the last 2 years on extended vacations and down 3 points on weekend vacations. So it doesn't mean that there are fewer weekend vacations. It means as a percentage, people are taking more longer vacations. So we'll look a little bit at generational differences, and Chris mentioned this earlier. We've been looking at generations for a while and came to the conclusion that you can't just focus on a generation, particularly a millennial generation, because it's too large. I'll show you some differences between the generations, and then we'll focus a little bit more specifically. So what I'm going to show you now, we're showing spend and number of vacations. Matures continue to spend the most on vacation. They also show a 4% drop. If you look at, and so the difference, however, with millennials, 4 points as well, but it's a 4-point positive increase. So while we look at matures as spending the most money, they're intending to spend less. We continue to say millennials tend to be the group that every year say, I'm going to spend more money in the following year. Matures still at the highest, but every year they come down a little bit in the amount that they're going to spend. I'm going to show you the number of vacations that they took, planning to take, and the difference. Yeah, it's down 3%, but again, it's 1/10 of a vacation, and it's higher than all three of the other generational groups. So that's great. What does that mean? What do I do? Focus on millennials. Create a marketing strategy that addresses 85 million people. No, you're not going to do that. We're going to show you a little bit of what that means in a minute. This is from Pew Research. This shows population by generation in millions and suggests that there will be more millennials than boomers in 2019. One thing I want to point out here is that we consider millennials to be people who were born between 1980 and 2000. So at the end of this year, the youngest millennials will be 18. So you could say, well, Steve, how can that be? If there's 74 million now, how can there be 76 million in 20 years? So Pew looked at immigration and their forecast for what the age of the people were who would be immigrating to the US, and sees an additional 2 million people in that age group between 2019 and 2036. What this does not forecast is Gen Z. The oldest Gen Z people are turning 18 this year, or last year, or turning 18 next year. They don't do any of their own travel spend. We don't cover them yet. We're likely to begin covering them probably around the time they'd be getting out of college. Because what we run into with this study is we have people who live at home, so they say they fit our income category, but they're not making any of their own decisions. So we try to exclude them. So we're really interested in people who are saying, here's where I want to go, and I have the means to get there. So we'll talk about millennials. They're not all the same. Take a look at those. All of those people are millennials. They don't all look to be the same age, do they? One of the things I'll point out is for those of us who have been in the business for a while, if you recall when we first started talking about millennials, they were all in college, or they had just gotten out of college and lived with their parents, and the only vacationing they wanted to do was they wanted to go to Costa Rica and go ziplining. And that was all the stories that we saw. This is all they want to do. Some marketers still keep them in that bucket. They still see them as in college, just out of college, without realizing that the oldest millennials are 38 years old. So if you think about the youngest are 18, the oldest are 38. For those of you who have passed 38, which is almost no one in the room, but for those of you who have, if you look at the difference in how you consume anything, including travel, when you were 18 versus when you were 38, I would argue it's not nearly the same. So how could you create a strategy that addresses all those people? We just want to continue to reiterate the fact that millennials are not all college age, just out of college. So here's how we describe them. Here's that college person just out, trying to figure things out. Then they get together, figuring it out, kind of starting to figure out what they want to do. And then they become a family. They're foundational. One of the things we write in here is that they're predictable. I'm not sure they're so predictable, but more so than someone who's 18. So we're going to share with you millennial families as we did last year because it's a very important target to go after. And we show you why this matters, the number of households and the amount that they're going to spend on travel. They have a higher spend per vacation. So if you take a look at the amount spent last year and the amount spent going to spend this year, we see a 12% increase. If you recall when I showed you millennials in general, I showed you about a 4% increase. So if you don't go farther, you could spend your marketing dollars on the wrong group. Clearly, the group that's spending more is the family group, not the singles group. Singles going down, couples going down, families going up. Families defined as a couple with at least one child. The number of vacations stays the same. Singles taking more. So they're spending less, taking more vacations, less money spent on vacation. Millennial families spending more on fewer vacations, so more spend per vacation. So now we look at spend over the past 12 months, and you can see that this chart shows you here's how many vacations they took, here's the amount of spend plotted on the left side. So what does this mean? What it means is that we have a big difference here between the number of vacations and the spend, which means more spend per vacation. So that's the positive that we see here. With fewer vacations and more spend, it equals more spend per vacation. So we recognize an opportunity for the luxury traveler. And for those of you who got this last year, we talked a bit about the luxury traveler and the affluent traveler. They're not the same person. People travel differently. People choose to spend their income differently, their disposable income differently. So we're going to talk about the luxury traveler for a few minutes. The portrait only talks to people who have a $50,000 annual household income and above, and who have traveled in the past 12 months. So if you take out the 50% of US households that don't fit into that group, you're left with the only 50,000 plus. Of that group, 30% earn $125,000 or more. So we consider them to be affluent. However, if you look at the bottom bullet point, only 37% of affluent travelers are luxury travelers. And we derive luxury travelers by responses to questions having to do with how people travel, whether they're buying first-class tickets, buying first-class upgrades, buying hotel suites, a number of questions that we put together and created a formula to say this defines the luxury traveler. So we're going to show you how the luxury traveler is a bit different than the affluent traveler. So here's the demos on the luxury traveler. I'll give you a second to look at that. And you can see a higher household income than $125,000. I'll wait till you finish taking pictures. Would you like, Robin, would you like me to pose in front of it? Okay. And here's their spending in trips. So look at the difference between luxury travelers and what they're telling us they're going to spend this year versus the affluent traveler who's not a luxury traveler. So 6,400 versus 9,000, nearly a 40% increase, 40% more spend on travel. They're also taking more vacations. So a target to go after is the luxury traveler. Here are some of the things that define a luxury traveler in the way that they think. And you can read that as well as I can. The important thing to note there is the difference between the luxury traveler and the affluent traveler who's not a luxury traveler. A substantial difference. And these are some of the things that you would expect to see. I'm going to show you a couple of things you might not expect to see. So yes, the luxury traveler expects to be treated like a VIP. And the luxury traveler believes that it's a deserved reward for hard work. However, luxury travelers also see the softer side of it. Look at the percentage who say going on vacation brings my family and me together. That's a significant difference versus affluent travelers. So don't just think these are the luxury travelers who are staying in the most opulent suites and having servants taking care of every need. That may be true, but the bringing the family together seems to matter more to them as it pertains to travel than it does to the affluent traveler. So look at why do they travel? And interestingly, luxury travelers significantly higher on 8 of the top 10 things that we measure in terms of why they travel. Relaxation, for as long as we've done this study, has been the top reason why people tell us they like to vacation. You could say that some of the things that we're seeing here are new and different, experiencing different cultures and new cuisines, becoming more popular than we've seen in the past to where they're now in the top 4. A lot of this being driven by the luxury traveler. This is what they want to do when they travel. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. We'll talk about why do they vacation. It's an investment. So let me take you through this. 82% of all travelers agree that the memories they get when they travel makes it worth it. So as Chris said to me, well, so does that mean that I think the story is 18% say they don't. Well, that's not true either. Only 3% say they don't. 15%, it's that group in the middle that don't typically have an opinion. So 82% say memories make the trip worth it. And 70% say focus on memories more than acquiring new things. You've seen that all before. Now let me show you why this matters. How do people, what motivates people to vacation? In 2016, we saw a significant increase in everything in that box. That all changed from 2015 to 2016 and has stayed there for the last 3 years. So all 6 of those things, or 7 of those things that we're highlighting, went up dramatically from 2015 to 2016 and have stayed where they are since then. So if you recall, we talked about how 2016 was the record year for travel at the time. Travel intentions were at a level we hadn't seen before. This is what caused people to do it. And this is why they did it. And we're seeing the difference, in some cases, very significant differences, at 15, 20 points of why people vacation, what causes them to go. Experience new cuisines. So I'll highlight that one. In 2014 it was 51, this year it was 70%. So it's 19 points up, or for the math people in the room, it's up 40%. So there's an opportunity for the culinary traveler. And we've seen articles, we've written articles on the culinary traveler. I'm going to share with you a little bit of information about the culinary traveler. First, here's what people like to do on vacation in general. And I showed you that before. This is where we got specific. So what do you like to do specifically as it pertains to culinary? Can I? Yeah, nobody goes for that one. Things that they like to do the most, locals, new, you can read it as well as I can. Interestingly, by generation, now let's look at this differently. The authentic food eaten by locals, significantly more by younger people than by matures. So those of us who are mature may not want to have that local food. However, millennials are definitely leading the increase in culinary travel. Take a look that they are significantly more of millennials on each of those items that are in that box. They want to do it more than the other three generations. Now we look at it even further, back by the groups that we mentioned before, families, couples, singles, and look at the difference that we see here. They want families and couples, you can see the top two significantly more than singles. Interestingly, winery tours by couples, distillery and brewery tours by couples and families. And the one I want to point out is food that reminds me of home. You'd say, well, why would families want food that reminds me of home? So if any of you travel with kids, your kids don't always want something that's authentic to the destination. They want something that they can get at home, something that's comfort food for them. I have a 16-year-old, I can't tell you how many times we had chicken fingers. I mean, that's what she wants. And so food that reminds me of home tends to pop for families, not so much for couples or singles. So the guess is that once a couple has children, they fall into more of the food that reminds me of home. What does a luxury traveler like to do culinarily, made up a word, when they travel? They like Michelin star restaurants. Not surprising. You might think, okay, high end, this is what they want to do. However, look at a couple of things, the other things they like to do. Street food. So these are high-end luxury travelers. They like street food. They want to take a distillery or a brewery tour. So again, we're trying to dispel the myth of the luxury traveler of only wanting to eat in places with fine china, 5-star service. They're much more diverse than we would tend to think on the surface. We created something called the Culinary Explorer. And you can take a look at how we define the Culinary Explorer. I'll give you a second to take a look at that. And I'll show you how culinary explorers may differ a little from non-culinary explorers. So here's why they matter. And they spend $44 billion in travel. So that would be a good reason for them mattering. Here's who they are and what they look like. So you may recall for the luxury traveler, we showed about $230,000 income. This is a substantially lower income and a more diverse group of people. Here's how they spend differently. Look at the difference in the amount of spend in the next 12 months. So the culinary explorer, likely to spend nearly 50% more than the non-culinary explorer. Likely to take a half a vacation more. Again, doesn't seem like a whole lot, but when you look at it over the number of vacations taken, it's a huge number. And they want to travel domestically. So one would think that a culinary explorer is interested in going to exotic lands to travel, yet 80% of their trips were taken to domestic locations. Where do they want to go domestically for culinary? And I'll point out, culinary travelers, this is the top 10. This is where they want to go, and Niagara Falls comes up at the top, one of the top 10. So a culinary vacation destination. I'm going to share with you why, because I'm sure many of you have been to Niagara Falls and never really thought of it as a culinary mecca. But there's an important distinction that we're going to get to in just a minute of why that might be on the list. This is how we'll start this. Culinary explorers actually like to visit national parks. What does that mean? So they like They travel for food, but they want to go to a national park. And this means something because only 34% of non-culinary travelers are interested in visiting national parks. 50-point difference. This is where Niagara Falls comes in. If you look at what they want to do outside, take a look. Culinary explorers are active. They're not traveling simply for the purpose of dining. They're traveling and having an active day. They're doing lots of outdoor stuff. So you could probably agree, if you went to Niagara Falls, there's a lot of outdoor things to do there. So perhaps that's why Niagara Falls falls onto that list. But take a look, significantly more culinary explorers are interested in doing each of the outdoor things that we mentioned in the survey. Online reviews, interesting to see, 66% visit an online review site, compared to only 15% who don't. And 25% post reviews online. They're much more invested in the experience. They want to read what other people have to say, and they want to post their own opinions. Now, clearly, they're taking more than they're giving, because way more are reading than writing, but that's not unusual. But we're seeing that substantial difference in that group, because that really matters to them. They're also more likely to respond to what they see online. Each of these 4 things means they're significantly more likely than non-explorers to feel that way. And interestingly, they won't consider a restaurant with a low online quality rating. So it doesn't mean they'll think about it, they might not go, they're not going if they see a low rating. And when we've talked to hotel clients in the past and to culinary clients, we tell them it's important when you have an negative online review to respond in a way where you're responding publicly and privately. You can't just write a response to the person who writes about a problem and say, and write to them and say, well, DM me and we'll talk about this. Because to the rest of the people reading those reviews, they don't know what you did. They don't know if you fixed it. They want to see you comment publicly. You can still have an offline or conversation that's more private, but the community reading the comment or the criticism that was made wants to know that you did something about it. And so when they see that, they're more likely to say, okay, you did something, I'm more open to trying your restaurant, as opposed to seeing negative reviews where there's no response from the restaurant. Now we'll take you through one last opportunity group, and this is in wellness travel. So here's who wellness travelers are. They say they're motivated to vacation to pursue wellness programs. So wellness very much in the news. Here's what they look like, their percentage of millennial families and luxury travelers. 27 billion in travel spend, and that's why they matter. Interesting definition of wellness travel. So take a look at that. It's kind of suggesting we don't want to lie on the beach anymore. We want to do something, we want to do more. So that's how we're kind of looking at wellness travelers as we proceed. Wellness travelers, so they want to be well, they want to do things. Look at the difference in nightlife. So as you might expect, as wellness increases, the interest in nightlife on vacation decreases. If any of you have been to a wellness resort, the nightlife options aren't great. It's dinner and that's pretty much all. I was at one in Carlsbad, California. It was almost like it was in Mayberry. It was 8 o'clock and all the lights were off and there was nothing left to do. Being a non-wellness traveler at a wellness resort, maybe I was a bit of a fish out of water, but I can see where this would drop a bit. We're looking at the global increase in wellness travel spend over the past few years. A substantial increase. So when we talked about that's why this group matters, they spend $22 billion on wellness travel or on travel. As this continues to increase, this group will become more and more important. So this is the first time we've ever focused on them. We'll share with you a little bit about who they are. Here's their definition. Again, a diverse group of people, and more likely than not to have kids. But they represent all 3 generational groups. And here's how they spend. They're more likely to have spent more likely to spend more next year, and up 15% from one year to the next. Down 1 point in the number of vacations taken, but still significantly more than the non-wellness, or all the non-wellness travelers. So a group that we should focus on. Internationally, it's an interesting difference. Half the vacations that this group plan to take in the next 12 months are to international locations. So we showed you the slide that showed the amount of spend. That's a global spend. So you have US travelers who are traveling internationally for wellness vacations, opportunity for domestic destinations to be more focused on that group because their spend's going to continue to increase. Here's where they want to travel internationally for wellness. These are the top 10 destinations, so it's not surprising that all of them would be significantly greater than the other, because we kind of loaded the deck there, but that's where they'd like to go. This doesn't, and let me point out, we're not saying, where would you like to go to experience a wellness vacation? We just asked them where they'd like to go, and we took the people who said wellness, and this is what we came up with. More interested in staying at a resort. So more likely than non-wellness travelers to stay at a resort, and much more likely to find an all-inclusive resort of value to them. So let's talk a little bit more about the wellness travelers and working out. 32% of them exercise more on vacation than home, as compared to 17%. So you'd say, well, they have more time to do it. Perhaps there's an opportunity for hotels, resorts to provide more direction for people who are vacationing or visiting them who have that predetermined, I'd like to work out more. I stayed in a hotel last night that actually had a exercise equipment in the room. Never seen that before. That was a little bit different. A ball to sit on, some bands to pull, a little bit different kind of experience. So that's going to a certain extent in that direction. But the opportunity for a resort to have people who are responsible for kind of organizing for people that don't like to work out on their own, putting together classes, groups, what have you, for people that are motivated by working out with others. Because we're seeing that number of people who are exercising more. And then on the opposite, we see the percentage, they're well-intended when they travel, but 34% of them, well, you can read that. And how many of us would say we've done that, fully intending to, and we haven't, and the rest of you are lying? And last, we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of travel, because this year we should probably be talking about it a little bit differently. So we asked people if they would identify themselves as liberal or conservative. 32% liberal. So the way that Chris would say, well, that means 68% are conservative, because there's no other choice. Only 29% are conservative. So what does that mean off the top? That 39% consider themselves to be neither. So what I'm going to show you is just how these two groups of people, how they look at travel and different aspects of their life differently. So we're looking at the polar opposites, not the people in the middle. So let's look at the difference. Liberal travelers likely to have spent more on travel past 12 months, likely to spend more in the next 12 months. Also, likely to take more vacations in the next 12 months. Okay? Robin, you good? Okay. It's all right. Their vacation motivations. So for the conservative traveler, it's all about relaxation. Number one, always number one. For the liberal traveler, now we're showing differences between the two groups. They show 6 or 5 things where significantly more liberal travelers tell us this is what they'd like to do versus conservative travelers. I'm not going to give you any editorial on this. You can kind of interpret it for yourselves. Booking. So how they book is even different. While we see a similar number of liberal and conservative travelers who book via OTAs, liberal travelers are much more likely to go straight to the travel service provider, to go to a comparison shopping site or a travel review site. So more of them going to a TripAdvisor type website. Sharing economy. Liberal travelers much more likely to have used ride sharing and much more likely to have used home sharing. So both of those show a significant difference between the liberal versus the conservative traveler. We ask people about their optimism. And conservative travelers are much more optimistic about everything we asked about. We can take a look at what those are. Significantly more optimistic. Yes, they're very optimistic. Yes, much more optimistic about the future of America. Finally, we ask, what do they do more of on vacation? And in the past, I've shown you what people do more of on vacation in general. Now we're going to show you what liberals do more on vacation versus what conservatives do more of on vacation. So you might come to the conclusion that while conservatives are much more optimistic about the future and all those things that we showed, if you're going to go on vacation, looks like a liberal's having a little bit more fun. Thank you for your time.